Hello. I want to thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. With all of the chaos that's happening in the Middle East, I've been asked several times what I think about it. To be honest, I'm not really sure why anybody would want to know or would care what I think about geopolitical issues. My degrees are in counseling, and I have the wonderful opportunity to serve the Greenbrier Church as their pulpit minister and vision caster, so I don't really have anything that qualifies me to speak with any authority on the issue. Add to that, I also cringe a little when I see or I hear ministers and preachers claiming that what's going on over there, well, those are signs of the coming destruction in the end times. I mean, truthfully, we've been in the end times for the past 2,000 years, ever since Jesus resurrected and ascended into heaven. There are a few things that I do know, though. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus says, "You will hear of wars and you will hear rumors of wars, but you should not panic. It's inevitable, but remember, the wars are not the end. The end is still unfolding. Nations will do battle with nations, and kingdoms will fight neighboring kingdoms. And there will be famines and earthquakes. But these are not the end. A war, a battle, a conflict, those are not the precursor to the end times. I mean, you do understand that ever since 1901, there has been a war somewhere around the globe every single year. I also know that over the last few weeks, the tensions that continue to rage in the Middle East might have dominated the global headlines. The pictures that are coming out across the news and social media of what's happening, they're heartbreaking and disgusting. People are hurting both in Israel and in Palestine at the hands of Hamas and the other terrorists. What's happened in that area is disgusting. It's inhumane, but it's not a new conflict. This has been going on for centuries. There seems to be a renewed emphasis on using this conflict to push an agenda or to cause fear, but it's not new. I understand that chaos has become pretty routine in our world, and in these moments, we're being called to point people back to Jesus. So this morning, if you think the sky's falling or that the world is spinning out of control, what I want us to do is to take a step back and to look at the story that God's writing. So what I want to use for our text this morning is found in 3 different Gospels. It's written about in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and all 3 of the Gospels tell the same 2 stories back to back. It seems that chaos was pretty routine in the world of Jesus as well, so I want us to look at Matthew's account, starting in Matthew 8, verse 23. Then Jesus got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came upon the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You have little faith. Why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" Matthew 8 is a unique chapter because Matthew follows the preaching of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 with the stories of how Jesus was healing people. So we go from teaching to healing. Jesus heals the man with leprosy. He heals the servant of a Roman officer. He heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then Matthew tells us that many demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus and he healed the sick. As people continue to hear about Jesus and to talk about Jesus and all the amazing things that he has done, the crowds grow larger. And whether they show up to hear him teach or to be healed from their diseases, whatever reason, people are leaving their towns and their villages to come and to find and follow Jesus. There's this constant flow of people in need. And every time Jesus tries to get off by himself to pray and to meditate, to get a bit of rest, the people following. So he's been preaching and teaching and answering questions, and according to Luke's account of this story, he's absolutely exhausted. Jesus tells the apostles, "Get a boat and let's cross over to the other side." There are times that I forget that Jesus was a man. I mean, I know he was a man, but There are times that I picture him as like Superman. On the outside, he looks like an ordinary, normal Clark Kent, but underneath his disguise is this indestructible superhero. I forget there are times that Jesus was exhausted and hungry and tired. I would imagine that a typical rabbi would probably work with 20 or 40 people. Jesus is dealing with thousands of folks who want to follow him wherever he goes. They want a little bit of his time, a little bit of his attention. It had to take a tremendous effort for him to get away, to be alone. So Jesus tells his apostles, let's get in a boat so that we can cross to the other side. This little trip is going to provide them a chance to rest, to get a break from the crowds. And once Jesus is in the boat, we discover that he's so tired, he's so exhausted, he falls asleep. You probably know what that's like, to be so exhausted. Once you get off your feet, you fall fast asleep. Here's the creator of the universe feeling that same exhaustion that we've all felt. We can assume that the apostles are probably exhausted as well. They've been right beside Jesus as he taught. They've been helping him tend to the people, the thousands of folks. They've been dealing with the elderly or with the children or with the sick. And when people are hot and tired, they're not the most reasonable people to deal with. But they still want to take care of Jesus. And so while he sleeps, they row. Mark gives us a little more information. He says it's evening when they set out. So the apostles are not just tired and grumpy, it's getting dark. And I know some of them had grown up on this water, but there's very little comfort in knowing that you're going to have to cross it, especially at night. At some point, you just get exhausted and confused. You spend all of your time and all of your energy just rowing, and you're not sure that you're making any progress. And if their situation is not bad enough, Matthew says, without warning, a furious storm came upon the lake. Their boat is taking on water. They're in danger. 4 of these guys were seasoned fishermen. They grew up on these very waters. And I would imagine that they had heard stories. They even knew some people that had lost their very lives on this water. That's why it doesn't take long for them to be overcome with fear and chaos as their circumstances go from bad to worse. In a matter of seconds, the disciples are blindsided. The peace they were experiencing turns into chaos, to fear. There's no warning of this impending danger. It just happens. And suddenly they're reminded that there are things in this world that are completely out of their control. The waves in the wind not only bring water into the boat, it also brings fear. There are a few things that happen to us when fear sets in. First, when we're afraid, we lose our ability to be polite or to be reverent. When the disciples go and ask Jesus, "Don't you care?" don't read that as a polite question or a whisper. This is a matter of life and death. We've thrown politeness out the window. When you read it, I want you to hear them shouting, much like a parent whose child has recklessly ridden a bicycle into the street in front of an oncoming car. There's fear and terror in their raised voices. Don't you care? And secondly, fear is usually accompanied by anger. Those two emotions always go hand in hand. The apostles aren't the last folks to be afraid and angry at the chaos that exists in the world. We still have to deal with the storms in this life that are big enough to sink our ships. I mean, trains collide, planes crash, marriages fail, careers collapse, diseases attack, war disrupts the peace. Depression darkens our souls. Broken people harass us. Death invades our lives. And just like the apostles in the boat, we turn to God and we scream, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown? God, aren't you paying attention to us? Father, don't I matter? Lord, what are you doing?" We've each asked those questions when we're disappointed in Jesus and God. For some reason, we come into this relationship thinking that once we give our lives to Christ, everything's going to be gumdrops and lollipops, unicorns and rainbows. We don't think that God is serious when he said that we would have trouble or that the world would hate us. We try to follow, we try to be faithful, And then we get upset and angry when we find ourselves in the middle of chaos. We look at the little boat of our lives in the middle of a very dark and angry sea, and we wonder, God, are you even paying attention, or are you just too sleepy to notice? We scream, do you care? Some people are uncomfortable talking to Jesus that way. I just think those folks haven't spent enough time in the Bible. You see, that kind of talk is pretty common. Jesus didn't die so that we could have a contractual agreement. He died to forge a relationship, and relationships require truthful talk. And truthfully, sometimes we get angry and disappointed or hurt. And if God gave us those emotions, they're not wrong, they're not sinful. When we're angry or hurt or disappointed, we need to say so. Anger and disappointment don't destroy a relationship. Failure to communicate destroys relationships. I think as long as we're talking, the relationship lives and thrives. Sometimes that talk is angry or passionate, not because we're irreverent, just because we're afraid. The blessing is that Jesus responds to our fears. The winds died down. It was completely calm. That's when Jesus turned and asked a question of his disciples. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? I think somebody told us when we followed Jesus that our life would be magic, that being his disciple would make us immune to the chaos of the storms and trials of life. But Jesus calls us to have faith. If you never face the storm, you never need faith. Being a disciple doesn't guarantee a storm-free existence. Being a disciple means that we can endure the storm knowing that if Jesus is in the boat, we'll be okay. Let me share a little reminder with you today. Things don't just happen. God is in control, and he wants us to have an active part in the work that he's doing. We need to be honest enough to admit that as long as we live in a broken world, there's going to be brokenness and disturbance and chaos. And oftentimes, like the disciples, we don't understand. We get blindsided by the sudden storms of troubles that come up. And that's when, more than any other time in our life, we need the presence of Jesus to make a difference. He doesn't guarantee an absence of trouble. He simply says we will survive the onslaught of chaos. But we also have to admit that chaos doesn't always attack from the outside. In fact, outside chaos isn't the worst kind of chaos. The worst kind of chaos isn't found in the sea, it's found in our souls. Which brings us to our second story. We pick up the text in Matthew 8, starting in verse 28. When he arrived at the other side of the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a herd of large pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off. They went into town and they reported all of this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. As soon as Jesus and his disciples get off the boat, they experience chaos once again. Immediately, 2 demon-possessed men who've been driven into isolation come out from the graveyard to confront them. Demons have a way of doing that. And it doesn't matter if it's a demon of addiction or the more politically correct demons of sexual expression, self-absorption, greed, or gossip. Our demons always drive us away from one another. Until, like the men in the story, we're living in a graveyard of relationships, crying out in the night, longing for companionship. It's compelling how the gospel writers tell these stories. First, we see the disciples dealing with their fear and their chaos of the sea, and now we're going to be introduced to 2 men who know the power of chaos in their very soul. Luke and Mark mention one man, and they describe him as wild and uncontrollable, sleeping with the dead in the graveyard and naked. Mark adds that the people in the town were so afraid of him that they put chains on his hands and feet, and every time they chained him up, he broke free, and the demons would drive him back into the hills among the tombs. These people had tried to control a demon-possessed man with chains and binding. That kind of reminds me that it's useless to bring physical weapons to a spiritual conflict. They tried to use chains, and we think that if we can elect the right officials or pass a few new laws or prescribe longer prison sentences, that somehow we can rein in chaos and reform the hearts of criminals and sinners. I've never understood why the church tries to press Washington or the state capitol for more laws. It makes more sense that if we would go out and reform hearts and the souls of people that we come into contact with on a daily basis. We need to introduce the world to a merciful and loving God. That's what we were called to do. Yet we make laws and people break the laws. We put people in prison, and more often than not, when they get out, they just break more laws and go back to prison. We're trying to find a physical solution to a spiritual problem. We all know people that need to be introduced to the power of our loving God, because God's the only one that can change a life. If we want a new standard of personal morality, if we want people to live lives of respect and compassion, that'll only happen when we fight spiritual battles with spiritual weapons. The text tells us that as soon as the man saw Jesus, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. All three gospel writers want us to understand that the demons see something that the disciples don't. The disciples asked, "Who is this man?" The demons know that Jesus possesses not only the power to calm the sea, but to calm the chaos in their soul as well. All three gospel writers say the demons asked for permission to enter a herd of pigs, and through an interesting act of mercy, Jesus cast them out into the pigs instead of to the depths and the dark places. And they immediately drowned the herd of pigs. What I find interesting about that, though, is that the men who are tending the pigs run into town and they tell everybody what happened, which I totally understand. And I also understand why all of the people would come rushing out to see what's going on, like we would slow down to see a wreck on the side of the interstate. But unlike the Samaritans in our text last week, these people asked Jesus to leave. The sight of the man who used to terrorize their village and lives is now sitting clothed and in his right mind, and that's too much for them to take in. You see, for them, Jesus was the source of their chaos, and now they're afraid. I'm pretty sure that if we would have gone to that village a few weeks before this event, we would have found a peaceful little community with people very comfortable and content. They had adjusted to what they considered normal. And while having a crazy, demon-possessed, naked man running around is not my idea of normal, it was normal for them. They were adjusted to it. They were comfortable with it. And now they find themselves in turmoil because Jesus has shown up and he disrupted their normal, their comfortable. Jesus arrives and shakes their complacency, and now they're filled with fear. And they ask him to leave, which is another reminder for us. You see, when these people finally found the one person who can control the chaos, they rejected him. They begged Jesus to leave because they were afraid that he would do more than just calm the chaos in this one or two demon-possessed man or men. They were afraid that he would change their normal. I think sometimes we learn to not only tolerate our chaos and our demons, we actually begin to enjoy them. And eventually we allow those demons to become our identity. We become identified by the demons, and if that's what we base our identity on, the last thing we want is for Jesus to take that away. If we're going to learn how to find peace in the middle of all of this chaos, we're going to have to learn to ask the same questions that we find in our text today. And I believe that the way that we answer these questions will be the source of our chaos or our peace. The first question that we have to ask is, who is this? Who do you think Jesus is? The rest of your life depends on how you answer that question, because who we think Jesus is determines how we live, how we love, how we forgive, and how we give our lives to the work of the kingdom. The second question is the one asked by the demons. What do you want with me? What does Jesus want with you? What does he want to do with your life? Because if we believe that Jesus is Lord and King, then he has to be able to direct the steps of our life. As we make our way to the tables this morning, I understand there are those of us today that are still trying to figure all of this out. There are some that are just trying to satisfy a curiosity or to find some peace or to answer a question. But there are some people that have a storm brewing in their life right now. There's a storm brewing in their soul, and they're trying to find the answer to those questions. And there are some that really have no idea why they're here at all. They're just here. I think oftentimes we go to the tables with more questions than answers. But this morning, I want to direct you to the one who can answer the questions you're struggling with. The answer to your question, what is the meaning of life, is Jesus. He can help us in times of chaos when the winds and the waves of trouble threaten to sink us. If we will put Jesus in our boat, we can survive the storm because Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus wants us to be involved in the work of the kingdom as he calls our souls out of chaos. He wants us to come to him in obedience and find the peace that our souls and our community so desperately need. I understand that following Jesus is not going to make any headlines in the papers. But when we fully trust in the power of Jesus, we have a story that's worth telling, and we live in a community that desperately needs to hear that story. We are surrounded by people that are living in chaos and have chaos in their souls, and what they long for is peace. And we go to the table this morning because we have been invited by the Prince of Peace, the one who can bring peace to our chaos, the one who can quiet the chaos that boils up in our souls, the one who invites us to take the message of love and forgiveness and grace and peace into a world that desperately needs it. We are being called to enter into the chaos of our community and bring about peace by introducing them to the one who we celebrate at the table this morning. So my hope today is that as you take the bread and you take the cup, you're able to think about and to be honest about the chaos in our lives, to be honest about what God is doing in our lives, so that we can be a part of the greater work of the kingdom and take our part in the story that he continues to write. I hope and I pray that you have a wonderful time of conversation around the table this morning. But more than that, I hope that you always remember that the Prince of Peace loves your soul and wants more than anything else for you to experience the peace that comes by being his child. Have a great week. Go in peace. And I look forward to seeing you very soon.